to the structural and normative underpinnings of international relations. Now, most, if not all, they have offered most, if not all, have given a normative study of international relations, but none of Muslim or scholars in Islamic studies have given an empirical approach to the study of IR, which somehow it scaffolds the Islamic ideals and values applicable to international relations, rather than going to the to the regularities and patterns in international relations. Now, these various norms and values produce several Islamic approaches, depending on number one, political theology or Islamic political theology, meaning orientation towards the legitimacy of international society. The second dependent variable that we can found is the sectarian conflict, which is versus Shia and Sunni. And third, ethnic, Kurdish, Arab, etc. Cultural, whether if it's Javanese or Sabaran cultures in Indonesia. And national, the concept of nationalism, whether it's Indonesian or Turkish or Iranian. But these Islamic approaches, they engage with the sources of Islam, particularly on the Quran, Sunnah, and Siyar. For example, these approaches will take the concept of the Ummah, which is that Muslim constitute a distinct and separate community, as given because it is well established in the Quran and Sunnah. And medieval jurists from 8th century to 18th century Common Era further elaborated, systemized, and developed Qur'an's and Sunnah's implication for between Muslims and non-Muslims relations. And part of this jurisprudence is what we call Siyar, which sometimes can be equated to the Islamic law of nation. Now, another bi-compartmentalized approach to foreign relations is the worldview of medieval scholars, where there is the abode of Islam, Darul Islam, and the abode of war, or the Darul Harb, especially in Hanafi jurisprudence. So these, at least we have 5 versions of an Islamic approaches to the study of international relations that exist in the literature. The number one approach is the radical approach. According to the literature, the radical approach or version of Islamic IR theory is that the notion of ummah and the solidarity it entails negate the fundamental unit of international relations, such as nation states, legitimacy of sovereign territoriality, and the Westphalian system are Western products and have no place to Islamic political thought. So nations, states, and empires can come and go, but Islam and Ummah persist. So, thus Muslims should strive for pan-Islamism. So we have the division, as I mentioned a while ago, the Darul Islam, the abode of Islam, and the Darul Harb, the abode of war. And the perpetual conflict between them continue. But there is also, according to this literature, there may also be non-Muslim societies that are considered as under the Darul Harb, or the abode of covenant, which Muslims can sign treaties with the non-Muslim subjects. And the second approach the second approach is the internationalist approach. According to internationalists, nation states, territorial sovereignty, and the Westphalian order are legitimate. What Muslims should do is to build institutions at transnational and intergovernmental level, similar to European Union, to bring the Ummah together. Now, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation is a good start, but its current form does not allow Muslims to achieve the OIC's full potential. As you can see, according to internationalists, the bicompartmentalized approach to foreign relations, such as the abode of Islam and the abode of war, is a reflection of medieval jurist, legal, and political answer to the international environment of their period, which somehow has little relevance to contemporary international relations, and that the interaction or the CR, the interaction between Muslims and non-Muslims, should be grounded on dialogue and diplomacy rather than hostility and war. Now, the third version of Islamic approach to the study of international relations is the Shia version. According to the Shia version, international relations is a struggle between mustakbirin, or in English, the arrogant imperialist powers, and mustadafun, or the oppressed of the world, reflecting the perennial struggle between imams and sultans. So that the unjust nature of existing international system is likely to continue until a just, powerful, prophetic voice emerges, such as the return of the Mahdi. So, in other words, similar to Khomeini's, Ayatollah Khomeini's Vilayat Ifaqi, which established the voice for justice in Iran, with its commitment to anti-imperialism and Islamic values, according to Professor Sabet, Iran represents voice of justice for Muslims and deserves to be the leading Muslim state. And the fourth Islamic version of international relations is the Islamization of the science movement, which emerged among the intellectuals of American Muslim, in particular in IIIT, or the International Institute of Islamic Thought, under the leadership of Ismail al-Faruqi. The Islamization of sciences movement advocated, quote-unquote, synthesis of modern knowledge and Islamic legacy, aiming to connect Islamic moral teachings and the ultimate end to social sciences. Al-Faruqi says, according to him, Islamization means to redefine and reorder data, to rethink the reasoning and relating the data, to reevaluate the conclusions, and to reproject the goals, and to do so in such a way to make the disciplines enrich and serve the cause of Islam. And the last version of Islamic IRT is somehow a fairly systematic approach, which is the Empirical Islamic IRT. This empirical approach, although it has been very, very normative, we can trace back to Muslim philosophers or thinkers in the medieval times. Among these, none has been as famous as Ibn Khaldun. From IR perspectives, Ibn Khaldun's work on the tripartite relationship between the rise of civilization, economic prosperity, and social disintegration is most relevant, according to Professor Pasha. Ibn Khaldun rejected the notion of state of nature and emphasized cooperation in society as his basic premise. He accepted that civilizations and culture are central to development of societies and relations between them. So, on these premises, Ibn Khaldun developed his understanding of state. For him, states emerge, mature, and decline. This repetitive pattern of rise and demise of states should be contextualized within the broader historical, social, and political processes, unlike reducing politics to state. In Ibn Khaldun's view, state is in part of continuum of politics, from the formation of tribe to a growth of empire. Ibn Khaldun's built two interrelated concepts that are particularly relevant to IR theory. The first one is the asabiya, or the concept of solidarity, which is, you can also find this concept within the realms of English School of International Relations, which is the solidarist approach to the international society. And the second one is the cycle approach to history of human societies, are also generalizable to international society and the rise and the fall of states and great powers. right now, me and other of my two colleagues and other cohorts of this research organization is that we're trying to decipher Ibn Khaldun's view on the civilizational state, which is somehow has an explanatory power to counter the dominant nation state that have been overwhelmed the study of international relations since the Westphalian system. So we are now trying to somehow decipher and study what is the episteme of Ibn Khaldun when he talks about the civilizational state. I think that's the end of my talk, and I will somehow accommodate questions after after the panelists presented their papers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nassef, for these very enlightening explanations of Islamic approaches to international relations. Now it's your role, Tariq Shalawi, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good day to you, everybody. So, from the early history of mankind, war has always been a viable and evident resolution wherein agents often resort to as a method of settlement for political, economic, cultural, and other kinds of disputes. In fact, in the Islamic as well as other religious traditions, war has been mentioned in the course of human history even before the creation of man. قالوا أتجعل فيها من يفسد فيها ويسفك الدماء. Will you place therein one who will make mischief therein and shed blood? The Quran. Classical and modern texts are evidently rich with citations of battles and epics. What comes to mind is perhaps two of the most important historical accounts of the Greek and Indian civilizations. The Iliad as an example, which revolve around war and not only mention war as an evident, natural way of solving dispute, but the whole thing is about war. And numerous inventions, strategic methods, and even animals had crossed the cultural borders between civilizations throughout war and military encounter. I said animals because here what comes to mind is, as an example, in the early eras of the Rashidi Khilafah of Islam, when the conquest of Persia was taking place, from the war of Qadisiyah, an elephant was actually brought to Al-Madinah for the first time, as was mentioned in Tariq ibn Asakir. And at that time, Al-Khalifa, which was Abu Bakr as-Siddiq, had requested that the elephant be taken in the streets of Medina so that everyone would have a look. And it was narrated that some people actually looked at the elephant, which was for the first time in their lives, and exclaimed, "Is this the creation of God, or is it a Persian machine?" War remains a concept that does bring to mind numerous ideas and related conceptions. I will begin with Hedley Bull's definition of war as my main starting point. And I will try, throughout some notations and accounts, to draw a map of parallels that puts Bull's definition in light of other points of view, as well as the classical Islamic contexts of war and the concept of just war. And I chose Bull's definition in particular because I thought it as simple and short and easy it might look, it actually encompasses a lot of important points. Hedley Bull, for those who don't know, is a scholar that is regarded one of the key scholars of the English school of international relations, one of the important theoretical schools. He was born in Australia and he was teaching in England for the rest of his life. In his notable work, The Anarchical Society, which is often regarded as the central work of the English School of International Relations, Hedley Bull defines war as an organized violence carried on by political units against each other. I would argue that this definition, as simple, short and concise it actually is, represents a definition that puts war well into an all-encompassing general perspective. War, in the human sense, has been much theorized and institutionalized, and this definition assumes the necessary nature of organization for the act of war. As Bull himself puts it, war is not simply a clash of forces. It also assumes the violent nature of the act of war, and what can be suggested is the most debated part of the definition is the assumption that war is carried out by political units. In fact, if what we mean by political unit in our modern times is the modern state, then the definition would fall short to include the war against Al-Qaeda or initiated by Al-Qaeda, and other movements such as the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, which regardless of its name is not a recognized modern state internationally. In this case, Quincy Wright's definition of war, which supposes it could be conducted by governments or entities aspiring to become governments. This would perhaps serve this purpose, but we can widen the concept of a political unit to the basic essence of a recognized political authority. So if we consider that a political unit, in Hadley Bull's definition, can encompass a recognized political authority, this then includes the examples that we have just mentioned. In the classical Islamic perspective, we find that war is always referred to as the means in the terms of disputes, an act that is conducted to achieve a certain goal, often emphasized that this goal is, first and foremost, peace. Therefore, it can be argued that war in Islam is not an object that is an ontologically separate being by itself, because what is referred to in the Islamic context is a violent action, which is also contained within Bull's definition. It is notable as well that the mention of fighting and struggle in the Quran had come in the plural sense for the Muslims, or in direction to the Prophet himself. This indicates the existence of a sort of a collective order or authority which is necessary to the existence of war, representing the political unit mentioned in Bull's definition, at least in an administrative role for the declaration or management of war. As the Prophet said, وَإِذَا اسْتُنْفِرْتُمْ فَانْفِرُوا. Go to the war in the case that you have been encouraged or told so. We can say by the authority, revealing an important trait of the Islamic war, which is the necessity of a commanding and administrative political authority. While the image that war brings to mind is not usually a bright one, war as a method to resolve conflict have been very much regarded far from the worst option to deal with disagreements. In fact, on many occasions, war has been referred to as the best, most notable or honorable way to solve disputes throughout human history. War has been glorified in the context of nationalistic and some religious narratives. And the concept of just war, a war that is justly fought in terms of its motivations and its warring methods, has been well established in such narratives, sometimes being a mere legitimizing tool. Just war theory is a doctrine that mainly concludes military ethics, which is studied by theologians as well as policymakers and military leaders. As can be seen from the name, the purpose of this doctrine is to ensure war is morally justifiable through a series of criteria that must all be met for war to be considered just. In the classical view, the criteria are usually split in two groups, whereas a third category is called for in recent times. The first group or category is the right to go to war, which looks into the morality of initiating or participating in war in the first place. The second is the right conduct in war, which concerns the moral conduct within war, including practices and strategies that are used in war. In other words, it is concerned with the forms warfare may or may not take, ideally. And the third category, as the role of international relations developed to address post-war considerations, is the morality of post-war procedure and reconstruction projects following the destructive consequences of a conducted war. The question of the correlation between the theoretical conceptualization of war and different theologies is wide and allows us considerable room for discussion and debate. So does the question of the importance of a religious justification for many examples of war throughout human history. It is perhaps that war in the human mind was always potentially wrong, causing destruction and havoc, violating the sacred right of life, and consequently perhaps invoking divine disfavor. A just war thus required some form of a ritualized declaration by a priest or a religious institution. Saint Augustine, in his famous work The City of God, notes that war can be justified as far as it can be included in the circle of divine command or in conformity with God's laws. In such principles, even slaying men, which is usually an act frowned upon, becomes legitimate, encouraged, and by no means violating the commandment, "Thou shalt not kill." It is argued that the concept, as recognized in today's academic context, had been basically outlined by Saint Thomas Aquinas in the 30th century in the Summa Theologicae, where he presents the general outline of what becomes the traditional just war theory. And as ethical considerations seem to be always central to the English school of international relations, it seemed they should also be actively shaping Bull's ideas on just war and the limitation of acts of violence conducted within war. The concept of just war in the Islamic tradition draws its sourcing from the Quran. In numerous verses was qital, fighting, jihad, struggle, and harb, war, were mentioned, always though accompanied by some sort of justification. وَقَاتِلُوا فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ الَّذِينَ يُقَاتِلُونَكُمْ وَلَا تَعْتَدُوا إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يُحِبُّ الْمُعْتَدِينَ. Fight in the cause of Allah those who fight you, but do not transgress limits, for God loves not transgressors. Many scholars in the Islamic tradition wrote on the conduct of war by the Muslim society or state. One cannot help mentioning who was often referred to as the establisher of the systematic rules of conduct in wars, Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Shaybani, whose tradition in Kitab Siyar al-Kabir, for example, was followed by many scholars and taken a base for developing theories about the nature of war in Islam. Dr. Hamidullah, in his scholarly work The Muslim Conduct of State, identifies a set of circumstances under which a Muslim state can initiate war, including the actual invasion of a Muslim territory, any provocative conduct short of invasion, punitive and preventive purposes, or in sympathy with their brethren living in another state, with some specific considerations to each case. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tariq. Now the floor is yours. Fariza Tariq. You will talk about the concept of enemy in the Hamas ideology.
Thank you. So, حركة المقاومة الإسلامية في فلسطين, the Islamic resistance movement in Palestine, known as Hamas, is a Palestinian national Islamic movement. And from the beginning of the Islamic establishing of Hamas, it's established on the foundation of the Muslim Brotherhood from in Egypt, which is established in Egypt. So So the main idea of the Muslim Brotherhood in Palestine and later Hamas was to make an Islamization for the Palestinian society. That was till beginning of the first Intifada. When the Intifada started, Hamas had to reconcentrate the concept of enemy and try to see how we can be more active, since most of the Palestinian parties, they have been involved in the fighting against Israel. So Hamas had to decide to start a kind of fighting against or resistance movement. So when Hamas started in the beginning, it was from the beginning the most important question is who is the enemy of the Palestinian nation, and is just the Jewish people, or Zionists, or the Israeli or the Israeli the state of Israel. So it was from the beginning, like we have 4 different concepts. But when Hamas started to fight, from the beginning, they used many different terms to ensure the one enemy, which is the Israeli conception, the Israeli enemy. So this paper try to analyze the concept in the Hamas ideology from the perspective of Hamas itself, because I'm tried to see, and this paper tried to see what is the image of the enemy in the literature of Hamas. And here I mean the leaflets of Hamas, and which is more than like 500, and the charter of Hamas. So if we look at them, we have the possibility to look at the literature of Hamas from inside. So this paper is more trying to understand the concept of enemy from 2 perspectives. One is the political perspective, and one is the religious perspective. Since most of the books written about Hamas either deal from political perspective or from Islamic perspective. So this paper will try to fuse these 2 perspectives together. So what is the meaning of enemy? So according to this paper, the concept of enemy is generally someone who is seen not only as a threat and danger for the other's existence, but also as a legal target to attack and to harm anytime, as long as there is no agreement or contract for peaceful period of time between the 2 sides of the conflict. However, for Hamas, the enemy is the Israeli occupation that, according to Hamas, committed a big injustice by occupying the Palestinian land, and during this process of occupation of the Palestinian land, this accused killing of hundreds of thousands of Palestinian peoples, and occupying the Israeli occupation force also expelled Palestinians from their houses and destroyed their cities and villages, and confiscated their properties and restrict their freedoms. However, in the charter, and especially in the leaflet from the beginning of Intifada, from the beginning of also establishing of Hamas, we will see that Hamas used 4 different terms to describe Israel, or to describe the state of Israel. So one, Zionist, Sakarya, or الحركة الصهيونية, the Zionist movement, مستوطنون, the Israeli settler, Israel as a state, Israel, and then we have also the last Israeli occupation, الاحتلال الإسرائيلي. So all of this concept was used in the Hamas literature in the beginning, between to be more limited to the time from Intifada till 1993. So if we look at most of the Palestinian, most of the leaflet from Hamas, they mixed this term without any distinction between all of them. But anyhow, always they meant the Israeli state. And it is more limited to the Israeli, but then we couldn't understand what is the difference when they said Zionist and what is the difference when they say Israeli occupation. So I will elaborate more later, but now I see one of the most important idea in the ideology of Hamas is the concept of jihad, because to understand the image of enemy, we have to understand the concept of jihad. Mostly, the movement, the Islamic movement, Hamas used the term resistance more than jihad, but they mean always with this term actually the meaning of jihad. So, and when we try to look at the leaflet of Hamas, we will see more concentrate on the locality of the movement. So when we look at their concept, for example, we have a document Hamas trying to describe and to present itself for the international community in a new way in 1990. It said that Hamas is a Palestinian national liberation movement fighting for the liberation of occupied Palestinian territories and for the recognition of the legitimate right for the Palestinians. So if we looked at this document, Hamas is trying to present itself in a new way, like more national way than using Islamic way, and also trying to use the term resistant and not the concept of jihad. So, and also if we looked at the charter of Hamas, it's trying to declare what is Hamas and the ideology of Hamas and describing itself. It's saying nationalism, which in Arabic it means wataniya, from the point of view of Hamas, is about of religious creed. So they say wataniya to be nationalism or to have more speak in the name of the land and countries connected to the Islam. So it's not a kind of paradox. To be concluded, the Hamas sees jihad as a local defensive action to liberate Palestine and to define the Palestinian nation. Hamas from the beginning, from the beginning of its activity, military activity, tried to always to focus on one enemy, which is and trying just to refer always to Israel. So we have then we have, for example, 1993, the Oslo Accord between PLO and Israel, and then PLO recognized the state of Israel, and then we start here to have problems and conflict between the Palestinians themselves, PLO and Hamas. And then we have, for example, this is an important example to show in this regard, that in 1993, the PLO, BA, arrest 3 of the Hamas member, and then judge them to kill 2 of them because they have been killing an Israeli soldier. So, and then Hamas tried to reply in a leaflet saying, even if the Palestinian Authority killed our Hamas members and confiscated their weapons, we will not attack them back, and we will see only Israel as the only enemy for the Palestinian people. So, one again, in interview, it's 1994, Sheikh Yassin was asked, the foundation of Hamas, he was asked how could Hamas balance between the national unity and jihad against the Israeli occupation. He answered, although the Palestinian National Authority arrested our members and confiscated our weapons, tortured our fighters, despite all this, we focus on 2 pillars. These are, first, to continue resistance against the Israeli occupation, and second, to keep the Palestinian unity and cooperation through the dialogue between the Palestinian nation and with patient. So this response shows very clearly that Hamas tried just to focus on one enemy, which is the opposite if we want to compare it with PLO, where they attack, for example, in München, Israeli citizen and accuse a lot of problem with European countries. So also, when we looked at, for example, at the leaflets of Hamas, we will see very clearly that always they're trying to talk about the US and trying to describe the role of US as not a neutral role in this conflict. For example, in 1991, we have a leaflet. It's called "The United States is a symbol of injustice and not a symbol for peace." Hamas is trying to tell and warn the Palestinian nation that the American play no neutral role in this conflict by supporting the Israeli military, for example, and supporting the Israeli occupation force. But nevertheless, Hamas didn't refer to the United States as an enemy for the Palestinian nation, but continue to see the state of Israel as the only enemy of the Palestinian. So what we can see here is that Hamas movement is a pragmatic one. It's not interested to lead jihad or resistance in the neighborhood states, for example, in Jordan or even in Egypt, where they can, I think, easily attack Israeli citizens. But they try to keep a good relation with the neighbors, with the other countries. And this has many perspectives to see. One of them that Hamas, according to the Charter, they see they have a problem with the Israeli people as far they are in Palestine. So when they leave Palestine, the problem is finished. So as well as they're not inside Palestine, Hamas movement said we don't have any problem with them. Our problem with them is just when they are inside Palestine. So the last point, Hamas built a very strong relation also between the concept of enemy, which is mean Israel, and the unity of the Palestinian nation. And we see this in many of the leaflets. For example, in leaflet number 89, 1992, Hamas said, "We are in need for an argument and comprehensive dialogue in order to have integrated program for resistance, and this based on the unity of the Palestinian." So the last point which I see important to mention in this regard is that Hamas see just merely Israel as the only enemy of the Palestinian, but they're trying to distinction between three of the Palestinian supporters or three of the Palestinian who maybe could support Palestine, and one of them the Palestinian Circle, which means the Palestinian people, and then the Arab Circle, and then it's include the whole of the Arab nation, and it doesn't mean Muslim or not Muslim, but as an Arab, because they see in the Palestinian case as basically as an Arabic case, and there's one the Islamic Circle from all of the Islamic words. So, and they said, for example, in Charter, in Article 14, that each of this circle has a role to play in this struggle against Zionism and its duty to fulfill, and trying to say all of these circles are very important to connect together to change, and that will lead to what they call the Day of the Liberation of the Palestinian land. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fadi. The floor is now open for questions, and allow me to abuse my position as chairman to ask the first one. To Fadi, there has been lots of talk about Hamas never being willing to recognize Israel, and that the Hamas Charter of 1988 is still viable, that calls for the destruction of Israel. Is this, in your view, a justified command, or has the position of Hamas developed ever since? In other words, would Hamas accept the idea of Israel in the states, in the borders prior to the Six-Day War, or would the struggle continue should the Palestinians get their state?
Firstly, we have to distinction between Hamas before 2006 and Hamas after 2006, because before we have a Palestinian movement which is trying to lead the resistance against the Israeli occupation and play nothing in the politics. But after 2006, Hamas found itself in the position of leading the Palestinian nation. They have the majority in the parliament, so we start to have a new perspective how is Hamas dealing. For example, in interview, it's lead from Washington Post, 2006, after the election, it was with the first Prime Minister of Hamas, Ismail Haniyeh. He said very clearly, if Israel go back from West Bank, which in West Bank, part of the Palestinian Jerusalem parts, and Gaza, we are in the situation to recognize the state of Israel. But if this is correct or not, we don't know. But this is very clear that if they come back from the Palestinian land, Hamas will recognize the state of Israel. And we have also the same point. We heard this many times from Khalid Mish'al. He said many times, if Israel come back from West Bank and Jerusalem and Gaza, we will recognize them.
Okay. First one, second, third, fourth.
Hi, I have a question for Badi as well. Following on Michael's question, the Prime Minister of Israel, Benjamin Netanyahu, gave a speech to the United Nations recently, back in September, and he said that Hamas shares the same ambitions of its fellow militant Islamists, and it wants to establish a Khilafah. And he also used a metaphor which resembles Hamas to Egypt, and he exactly said that they are the same branches of the same poisonous tree. So I'm just wondering your take on this statement, and do you think that Hamas is as much a threat to other Arab countries as it is to Israel, depending on Netanyahu's perspective?
First of all, if we look at the story how Hamas started, we will see it's connected with the occupation of the Palestinian land. And when we come back before the occupation of Palestinian land, we don't have Hamas. So Hamas came, I think, as a reaction for the creation of the state of Israel in Palestine. I think this is always a kind of play trying to, the Prime Minister especially, and the government of Israel in general, to play, to try to say all of the Islamic movement, they are the same, they have the same face. But I don't think so, because when we look at how Hamas react and how Hamas, for example, in the last attack on Gaza, it was very clear. We had this many times from the Qassam, the military wing of Hamas, saying to the Israeli civil listing, don't stay around Gaza because we are not interested to kill anyone. Our target is just to kill the military who are trying to attack us and kill our people. So we are trying to defend the Palestinian, and I think this is a kind of, when he said this, he's trying to just have more solidarity from a state who support Israel, and try to play on this to say we are always in the same place, we have to attack this Islamic movement. But I don't think they are the same. And even in 2009, we have a group which is connected to Al-Qaeda. They try to establish Imara Islamiyya in Gaza, and Hamas eliminated all of them because they said we are not interested to make Islamic Emirate in Gaza because this is not the situation. Our target is just to liberate Palestine and not to make a kind of ISIS or something.
Yeah, number two, what did I say? Okay, 2, 3, 4, then you 5.
Thank you. My question is to Tariq Sharawi. You defined a just war and separated into 3 components, one of which was right to go to war. And could you elaborate this a little bit more, especially on the perspective that many wars have been initiated for the purpose of looting goods? What's the Islamic critique of this?
Thank you very much for this question. Yes, the first group of criteria are related to the initiation of war, and which is quite very well related to the purpose behind the war. And as you mentioned in your question, a lot of the wars happening in recent times seem to be directed or motivated by economic motivations, whereas this is exactly what this criteria has to be connected to in terms of defining whether it is a just cause to go to war. And in the Islamic perspective, and thank you very much also for this because it is very important, in the Islamic perspective, according to traditional scholars, beginning with the tradition of Muhammad bin Hassan al-Shaybani and what follows him throughout the Hanafi school and the other schools of law, what can be considered as a just or morally correct motivation or justification to go to war is summarized under the great wide Islamic notion of fi sabilillah, in the path of God. So whatever is fought in that way, according to the classical Islamists, is a justification that is enough for war. What goes more in detail under this category is what they elaborated more in terms of being attacked in the Islamic territory, for example. That is one of the main ideas, being attacked in the Islamic territories, or being dealt in a way that is just short of an attack on Islamic territories. For example, killing the messenger that is sent to some other parties, such as what happened in the early Medina period and in the Prophet's life, wherein killing one message bearer resulted in a just motivation for war. Another thing is the protection of the other Muslim members in another country if rights have been violated. This point particularly has more elaborations, and it goes under so many different situations one has to decide, but mainly these reasons fall under the category. Yes.
So, based on your description, jihad for the purpose of spreading Islam is not just, according to...
Well, the thing is, jihad in itself can be a notion that we can distinguish from war, because the translation of jihad as holy war, I think, is problematic a little bit. War in that sense is a military conflict which is perhaps in the Islamic sense, the word harb has been used in a way that is unliked or inevitable, not in the way of spreading the religion, which I think falls under jihad, a very different category. One might say that this turns inevitably into a war thing, but in my studies of the Islamic tradition, war as a concept has been described in a way that is more apart from desirable conflict. Thank you.
Two questions. Mr. Sharawi, isn't it prohibited and haram for a weaker Muslim community or an army to fight against a stronger one with special to contemporary Israeli-Palestinian conflict in Islamic jurisprudence? The second question to Mr. Zatari, what does it mean occupied Palestinian territory? What are the boundaries? UN scope or set borders? Thank you. For Hamas.
Should I start? Thank you very much for this question also. I would say that the category should fall under too big a consideration for just saying that it is haram to fight against a stronger army. I would say many other considerations would be taken into place, such as strategic configurations in the field. I have never come across a place where it clearly says that it is haram to fight a bigger and stronger army. In fact, the history is full of examples where the Muslims fought with armies that appear to be stronger than themselves. And in the Quran, إن يكن منكم 20 صابرون يغلبوا 200, for example, an ayah that says if you had 20 people who are well enough patient, they would be 200. There is a notion of God's help within the Islamic notion of war. There is a notion of that, we cannot deny it. But I would say that under the priorities fiqh, it can be studied, and it can be said that, for example, if this represents an annihilation of Muslims, then yes, the protection of Muslim life is more important than achieving victory. That's what I can answer in this.
Thank you for your question. If we try to look at Palestine, from without perspective of Hamas, we will see the whole of the land is under the Israeli occupation. Even, for example, if Mahmoud Abbas, the Palestinian president, he wanted to move from his home to the Muqata, where he is walking, or to Hebron or to Bethlehem, he has to coordinate this with the Israeli occupation forces, which means we have a kind of land which is completely under the Israeli occupation. This is in general, but if we look at Hamas charter and also the leaflet, this is very clear. Palestinian land is between the river and the sea, which include the whole of the Palestinian land before 1948, before establishing the state of Israel. And but Hamas say this very clearly, that if the Jewish people want to live inside Palestinian nation, Palestinian state, they are welcome. So the idea is, they said now about the occupied Palestinian as a whole, but they doesn't exclude the Jewish people to come and to live with the Palestinians.
So Hamas is not in favor of two-state solution and coexistence of Israel and Palestine.
This is very complicated question, and it's
like in parallel to the borders.
this is
48 borders, which means that there's no any place for which.
This is very complicated question, because we have this solution before establishing even the Muslim Brotherhood in Palestine, even before establishing the state of Israel in Palestine. It was this resolution was always on the table to make two states in Palestine. But this is very complicated with Hamas. But as I said, when they got the majority in the parliament, they said very clear, we will accept Israel as a reality if they come back from our land, with West Bank and Gaza and half of Jerusalem, and we will recognize this reality as a reality, kind of reality for the next times. But we are not sure about this, if it's correct or not.
No, it's okay.
Syrian background, usually what we saw in Syria, that movements concentrate on resistance, they forget they are fighting in civilian areas, so they don't have a priority of governance or of services and managing the civic life. You said that your main question, your paper, has Hamas defined their enemy. So, is their philosophy that they are living in a war, and is there any place for governance as a reality?
You mean to get inside the politics?
Yeah, politics and management. Municipalities giving services, education, health. Is it a priority, or is there aim to mobilize all the society in this resistance?
This was the main issue before establishing of Hamas, when Sheikh Ahmad Yassin, he was trying to build a community of let's say people have a Islamic background in Gaza. They start in Gaza, they start in late 17 and 18, trying to build a mosque and trying to make a lot of activities. And after that, they start to make a lot of charities work. Ahmed Yassin said this in many interviews. He said, what about if tomorrow or today the Israeli occupation leave the country? What we have to do? We have no people to leave. So he said always, and this the perspective of Hamas, also in the left, as I remember, that we have to try to build NGOs, and this is why Hamas is very strong in the surety in Hebron, in Ramallah. You will see they have a lot of NGOs in all of the cities. We can see this, and basically they started from the charity works. Why? They said we have to start with this, and then to create leadership in the Palestinian territories. In the case of that Israel leave the country and the Palestinians liberated, then we can build our state. So this is very important and priority for Hamas, I think. And they get inside the parliament 2006, not I think to be in the politics, but trying to protect the resistance against Israel. So they said we used to fight with weapons. We want now to fight with politics and weapons. Yeah.
My question will be Mr. Sakarya. And Huntington famously wrote and predicted that the clash will be primarily based on culture and will be between Islamic world and West. So I would like to ask you that: is it possible to make a dialogue between West and Islamic world nowadays, in light of, for example, last recent tensions in Islamic world?
I will not answer in general. I will answer in particular regarding to Hamas. I think Hamas has, this is always the case. They're trying to show the only enemy is Israel, as I said, and we don't have even problems with countries that support Israel. We will never attack them. So I think it should. I think there is no problems between Hamas and European countries, because if we look at a specific country like UK, for example, they said the military wing in Hamas is terrorist, but Hamas politics is not. So they try to distinguish between two Hamas, politics and military. I think it's possible. Why not? Because I don't believe in this idea of conflict of the civilization, and it has a special, I think, cases why he wrote this book and what he wanted to reach. But I think the opposite is correct.
I will answer the question. The fault line, according to the Huntington thesis, Clash of Civilizations, will be based on culture. Culture is rather tremendously dangerous, because as you can see, since the time memoriam of the Islamic civilization, there have been nodes of exchanges, of cultural exchanges from Hellenistic culture, wherein Muslim philosophers have adopted the philosophies of Aristotle, Plato, and et al. And then we also have the Caliphate in Spain, which is the Al-Andalusia, wherein they have the convivencia, where there is a harmonious living or coexistence between the Jews, between the Muslims and the Christians. Even during the Abbasid dynasty in the House of Wisdom in Iraq, in Baghdad, the ones who translate scriptures or sciences were not non-Muslims, were Christians. So I think that the reason why he argued on that premise is that we have a tremendous shift of political configurations within the world history, where you can see the dominance of impositions of European cultural, political, and social when they colonize the Muslim lands. and until now we can even still somehow experience the legacy that these colonials have left. And you can see the responses that Muslim political elites have replied to colonialism. As you can see, we have Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, Westernization, bringing down the caliphate, and you can see other responses from other Muslim political elites. Thank you.
Any further questions? If not, I would like to ask Nassef a question myself. When we look at the forthcoming of the Islamic State, is there any Islamic approach in the sense of condemnation or in the sense of dealing with this challenge by leading Muslim scholars who try to find a theoretical framework in order to understand this success of Islamic State, and how do they judge about this movement? Do you have any information on this matter?
Are you talking about the ISIS?
Yes, yes.
I think majority of the Muslim scholars have responded to the why these phenomenon called ISIS is an Islamic phenomenon, which have tremendously go against with the teachings of Islam. So I don't think that it is, even for the media and even for the academia, it is somehow troubling that we put legitimacy towards the recognition of these bandits, of this thug group as an Islamic State. So I don't think that from that point of view we can determine somehow what are the epistemology or ontologies, or what are the structures, organizations, even the theoretical presumptions of how an Islamic State should be. If we will just be narrowly go with how these ISIS have been successful in masquerading their ideals, which somehow it's a very troubling idea to be concerned with.
I have one more question. No, you go ahead first. You have one.
My question is also for Nassef. In your speech, you mainly dealt with the cooperation within Islamic countries when you define Islamic approaches. But I would like to hear more about Islamic approaches towards non-Islamic countries. What have been the norm? What are the Quran's teachings in that case?
That's the reason why in my paper I have delineated the 5 versions of Islamic approaches that exist in the literature. And one of the surprising results why there is under-theorization of Islamic IR theory is because of this a fairly systematic analysis of the CR, or the relations between Muslims and non-Muslims. What we are trying to aim is to build an empirical approach to somehow give an empiricism, an Islamic empiricism towards the study of international relations. So most of the scholars of Islamic political thought, they have dealt with, and even jurisprudence, they have dealt with relations between Muslims and non-Muslims since in time immemorial. And for example, Yusuf al-Qaradawi, he has a notion on methodology of how Muslim minorities should somehow deal with if they're living in non-Muslim regimes, such as, for example, the Turkish community in Germany, or the Muslim community in France, in UK, in America, and so on and so forth.
And if I may ask a final question, should there be no more questions from your side, I would be very interested to learn from you, Nassef, how Islamic scholars react to the fact that the West, so to speak, dominates world institutions, and on the other hand there are Islamic approaches, but they seem to be irrelevant in world politics. So how do Muslim scholars deal with this contradiction between their own understanding of Muslim values and the strength of Islamic theology on the one hand, and the given reality that Western policymaking really dominates the agenda of the world?
That's a good question, because I think that what I have emphasized in my paper is that the Islamic approaches towards the study of international relations is fairly normative and not bounded empirically. If you're asking why there is a dominancy of Western policy making in the world institutions, international organizations, is because of the decline of the let's say it started with the decline or of the demise or the decline of the Ottoman Empire. And as you can see, it started with the subjugation of many Muslim lands under colonizers, and they changed, modified how political institutions and entities such as or any polities that Muslims have created since the entire duration or period of the Islamic civilization. And you can see that there is a gradually or even a hastily adaptation of Muslim political elites to the imposition of Western colonizers in their political, social, and somewhat even cultural lifestyle. And I think that's why we have a dominancy of Western policy making in world institutions such as APEC, United Nations, and other international organizations. I think that's it.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, if you have any other questions, as you can see, we have this is our website. You can just contact me or other of my co-founders. And if you have any further questions, you can just you can find the contact procedures in that website. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Any more questions? Well, in that case, the session is closed. Thank you very much.